All right. Good morning, everybody. And thank you all for joining us today for our forum on student loans and entrepreneurship, current landscape and policy considerations. My name is Anya Pichenina, and I'm a program officer focusing on research translation work here at the Kauffman Foundation. To frame today's conversation, I would like to begin by sharing a few key pieces of information on this topic. Student loan debt nearly tripled in the last 20 years, from $500 billion to over $1.5 trillion. According to 2019 data from the Pew Research Center, nearly 1 in 6 adults in the US has outstanding student loan debt. Meanwhile, the share of new entrepreneurs aged 20 to 34 declined from 34% to 27% between 1996 and 2019. At the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, one survey study estimated that the median business with more than $10,000 in monthly expenses had only about 2 weeks of cash on hand. According to the same study, most of the businesses surveyed planned to seek funding through the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security, or CARES Act. However, many anticipated problems with accessing the program, such as bureaucratic hassles and difficulties establishing eligibility. Student loan debt came in here as well. Until February of 2021, business owners with delinquent student loan debt could not access the PPP loans under the CARES Act. This exclusion disproportionately impacted sole proprietors, independent contractors, and self-employed individuals, especially Black and Brown business owners who are already less likely to receive PPP loans. This is one example of how student loan debt impacted entrepreneurs' ability to keep their businesses going during the COVID-19 pandemic. Today, we hope to answer questions about what other obstacles student loan debt may pose for entrepreneurs and aspiring entrepreneurs. How does the COVID-19 pandemic play into this dynamic, and how entrepreneurship support organizations and policymakers can address these obstacles and prevent them from arising in the future? We have 2 exciting panels ahead of us today. First, we will begin with a panel discussion on what we know about student loan debt impact on entrepreneurs and aspiring entrepreneurs. Our panelists will highlight what research work has been done on this topic, what are the gaps in our knowledge, and discuss opportunities for further inquiry. In our second panel, we will hear about the program and policy work that is being done to address the obstacles that entrepreneurs and aspiring entrepreneurs with student loans face today, especially as they navigate the COVID-19 pandemic. We will also discuss policy and program priorities and potential solutions for the student loan debt issue as it relates to entrepreneurship in the post-COVID economy. After each panel, we will have a moderated Q&A, and I would encourage you to send in your questions to us using the Q&A box throughout the presentations. Our speakers today come from a diverse background in research, policy, and nonprofit sector. They will cover a broad spectrum of research and policy questions, and I would like to thank each of today's participants for taking the time out of your very busy lives to share your insights with us. We host this forum to provide a platform for an in-depth discussion on how to solve problems, and the Kauffman Foundation does not take a political position or legislative position on these discussions. So today we are first going to lay out what do we know about student loan debt and entrepreneurship, and by extension, what information are we missing and what additional research needs to be done. We are very fortunate to have 3 excellent presenters for this panel. First, we will hear from Dr. Sandy Baum, who is a non-resident fellow, for the Center on Education, Data, and Policy at the Urban Institute. Next, we will hear from Dr. Karthik Krishnan, who is an associate professor of finance at Northeastern University, and also the CEO and co-founder of MentorWorks Educational Capital, Inc., and Ms. Awesta Sarkash, who is a government affairs director for Small Business Majority. So for the next 30 minutes or so, we will have each of our panelists give a short presentation, followed by a robust Q&A session. So without further ado, please welcome our first panelist, Dr. Sandy Baum. Sandy, please take it away.
I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. And I have done some work. I do a lot of work on student debt. I know more about student debt than I do about entrepreneurship, so I will say that up front. one of the issues is that it's really hard to figure out exactly what we mean by the question of how student debt is impeding the formation of new businesses and how we can test that. So the real relevant question, I think, is how many people there are who would have started successful businesses if they had not borrowed for higher education. And there are surely people like that. But there is also the question of, does this mean that if someone else had paid for their education, they'd be better off and there would be fewer barriers? The answer to that is, of course, you're better off if somebody else pays for your education. But it's a different question to ask whether these people would have been better off had they not gotten the education that they got. And for many of them, borrowing was a necessary step in getting that education. So in order to test the impact of student debt, it really requires defining a counterfactual. In other words, to whom do we compare these people? And there are many studies that actually compare college graduates to adults with the same level of education who don't have debt. And that's not really very informative because it's obvious that you're better off if you don't have student loan payments to make, and that if you do have to make those payments, you face barriers that people with the same education but no student debts don't face. But we also know that individuals with higher levels of education and more experience in their industries and managerial background are more likely to succeed in starting new businesses, and that people with higher levels of education are more likely to have those characteristics. So the real problem with student debt is that higher education is a very good investment on average, but it's risky. And it just doesn't work out well for everyone. So you have people who have student debt, but don't have the incomes necessary to repay those debts. And I would note, however, that it's risky as it is, not nearly so risky as starting a new business, because a much larger share of people investing in higher education succeed than people investing in small businesses. But that doesn't mean we want to discourage the investment. It means we want to help people to invest wisely. And we want to make sure not that everybody does whatever. Don't just start any business. Don't just go to college whenever, wherever, no matter for what reason, but think carefully about it. So one real issue is that lots of people have student debt and very few people actually are serious potentials for successful entrepreneurship. So it really makes sense to target the solutions for entrepreneurship. Let's look at individuals who are potentially entrepreneurs who have student debt problems and try to help them solve those problems. Finding a whole new system for financing post-secondary education and eliminating student debt problems for everybody. We need to do these things, but that's not the way to find the solutions to the problems of entrepreneurship, because most people with student debt, like most people, aren't going to be successful entrepreneurs at all, or certainly successful. Just a few facts about student debt that I think are important for background. We frequently talk about the amount of outstanding student debt instead of talking about how many people are borrowing and how much they are borrowing. And the real problem is what's facing individual students. So this is a graph that starts in 2003 with the amount of outstanding debt and the annual amount of borrowing. And you can see that the amount of outstanding debt has gone up 4.5 times, but the amount that people borrow every year has not risen nearly so rapidly, and in fact has been declining every year for the past decade. So that's a really important thing to think about in terms of the student debt problem. And it is the amount that
I apologize for interrupting you, but we cannot see your slides. We cannot see your graph. Yes.
Really? Okay. Well, I think I should just probably talk about it instead, because otherwise I'll just use up all the time showing the slides. So the fact is, so I will repeat what I just said, that the amount of outstanding debt has risen really rapidly, but individual students are actually borrowing less and less. And it is undergraduate students who are borrowing less and less. An increasing share of the borrowing is among graduate students. And if you think about that, you realize that people holding these amounts of debt have graduate education, and we need to think differently about them in addressing the student debt problems. So another issue in terms of the outstanding debt is that a very high percentage of the outstanding debt is held by a very small percentage of borrowers. So in fact, about 5% of the people with debt owe about 1/3 of the debt. And that's because these are people, most of whom went to graduate school, who borrowed a lot of money. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, the bottom the people who have small amounts of debt are a large share of the borrowers. So about a third of borrowers owe only just 5% of the debt. So what you have again is debt concentrated among a very small share of borrowers who borrowed a lot of money. So again, the number of people who have student debt is huge, about 45 million. The number of people who start new businesses each year has been rising in recent years, but it's still about 800,000. So to figure out how to solve the problems of getting more people to start new businesses doesn't mean you can at the same time address all the issues facing the 45 million holders of student debt. But one really good solution that we have in place already that is frequently omitted from conversations is income-driven repayment. Right now, about a third of borrowers and about half of the outstanding student debt are in repayment plans where you just pay a share of your income, where if you don't have income or you have a very low income, you don't actually have to make monthly payments. During the pandemic, no one has to, but before the pandemic and after the pandemic, the income-driven repayment plans are not perfect. There are lots of problems with them. They really need to be modified and simplified, and getting into them and staying in them, it has to be easier. But if you think about it, if the problem is, what if I try to start a business and then I don't have any income for a couple of years? The answer is, we shouldn't make you make student loan payments during that period of time. That's true whether you have a low income because of being an entrepreneur or whether you have a low income for other reasons. And so really focusing on strengthening these plans so that you can take a risk, you can become an entrepreneur. And if you can't make your loan payments for a while, you just won't have to, is a really reasonable solution, and one that we should focus on as a way of addressing any barriers that do exist. So again, it's very hard to know whether it's student debt that is causing, any decline in entrepreneurship, or whether it's a host of other factors, and student debt is a small piece of it. But in any case, what you need to do is have a solution when student debt does interfere. And just because I know the next panel is going to address this question, I just want to say that it's pretty clear to me that forgiving all student debt would not be a progressive policy. Most of the debt, again, is held by a relatively small number of people, most of whom went to graduate school. A lot of households are really in need of support, especially now. Something like a $10,000 handout to a high share of households is probably a good idea, but excluding those who have never gone to college doesn't really seem like a good way to distribute such a handout. Just excluding people who've never gone to college, in fact, excludes a disproportionate share of Black families. There are trade-offs. It would increase the federal debt and deficit. There are lots of other forms of debt that also are causing problems for people, like medical debt and auto debt. And so being able to do something about those forms of debt may also be an important strategy for helping people to overcome barriers to entrepreneurship, as well as to other kinds of activities that would improve their lives. So basically what I want to say is that whether or not student debt is causal significantly in reducing entrepreneurship, and my sense of the literature is that it's really not a big factor. Still, it obviously affects some people and is a barrier for some people. We should address that problem, but we need to address it with targeted solutions, not by thinking we're just going to eliminate student debt altogether. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandy. Our next speaker is Dr. Karthik Krishnan. Please take it away.
Thank you, and thank you for having me in this panel. So, my background is higher education. I've been in this space for over 20 years, and I've been writing about the student loan space probably north of like 6-7 years now. In the process, I myself became an entrepreneur, and so I have to disclaim everything, saying that my venture has nothing to do with this research. So I'm going to be talking primarily in my capacity as a researcher who has kind of written in the space. I think Sandy's given us a good introduction. This is certainly a big problem, and we all know about it. We all know about the growth. I think if you look at the stats on student loans, and if you look at the stats on startup activity, they're pretty much the opposite of each other. It's not to say, as Sandy pointed out, that reflects causality, but certainly it's something worth at least trying to understand, well, what is the linkage between these two patterns here? And on the right side, you'll see this graph. This is based on a survey of consumer finances that I've put together with my co-author, Pincho Wang. This was published in Management Science. And those numbers are pretty worrisome, right? I mean, in terms of what we know about how important startups are and early stage ventures are in economic growth. They are pretty critical for employment. They are pretty critical for establishing the new generation of companies that are productive, and trying to understand the linkage between the student data growth and kind of decline in startup activity is important. And so, there's anecdotal evidence, right? So there are people who certainly feel that having that student loan in their books has hurt them, has made it harder for them to take risks, because after all, you're taking in a startup, you are taking risks. You're taking, market risks, you're taking technology risks, you're taking other kinds of risks. And if you have a loan that is non-dischargeable, in effect, you're really taking on a negative liability, which stays with you regardless of kind of your situation. Certainly, policymakers have looked at this, and the general sense is, look, these student loan burdens kind of require these individuals to divert cash away from their businesses. These consequences of not meeting your loan obligations can actually be pretty severe. And so, the other side of the story is, well, startups come in many flavor, right? I mean, you can have a very safe, maybe a not very innovative startup. You can also have kind of more innovative, highly risky ventures. And just as a proxy for how innovative or perhaps how impactful a company is, some people use in the literature whether or not you get venture backing or early stage investor backing, because that's a signal that somebody's willing to invest in your company. And another question becomes, well, yes, you can perhaps put a linkage between student debt and startup activity, but is that really going to affect what we consider to be high growth, high value add ventures for the economy? One of the one of the papers I have written looks at venture back or getting venture financing as a proxy. It's not a perfect proxy. It's not the only proxy. It's a proxy for whether a company can usually have high impact. And this chart here highlights, well, typically startups founded after 1974, if they're venture backed, they are they have a good proportion of the economic activity. They represent a good proportion of the economic activity in terms of employees, net income, a big chunk of R&D, that is 85%. And so it's certainly another important aspect we should try and understand. So I'm going to just highlight in some of the work that I have done in the past, what have been our key findings. And again, to Sandy's point, I'm going to try and address both the questions of correlation, but also of causality, because that's going to be really important. Just because student debt is correlated with entrepreneurship one way or another doesn't mean it actually causes a increase or decrease in entrepreneurship. And that's something that economists take a lot of care and try to address as much as possible. So in our first paper that I wrote with Pincho, that was in the Management Science, we find that entrepreneurial starts are negatively associated with student debt. And this was at first in association. We simply ran a basic regression model. But we were able to show with some natural experiments that there was actually a causal relationship, because A is correlated with B doesn't mean A causes B. So what you want to try and do is find a third effect that affects A but not B, which then moves the needle on the B variable. And that's what, as researchers, we spend a lot of our time trying to grapple with. The other relationship we find is that conditional on survival, student loan borrowers who start companies have smaller firms and lower income levels in those companies, which kind of goes to the well, yeah, you can start a company, but is there actually an impact in the intrinsic margin of how, if you have student debt, can you perhaps scale up? Can it be a barrier in taking risks and so on? And this is all predicated on the fact that if you take on student loans, starting a venture after that is a riskier proposition, and we'll talk about why. And we find that, well, we're able to show some of that, right? I mean, student loan borrowers we find who start companies, and particularly those with less successful ventures, are more likely to fall behind on their loan payments. All of this, by the way, is done with Survey of Consumer Finances data. And so the first paper really dealt with the broad statistical and causal relationships between student loans and entrepreneurship overall. There are some elements of, well, is this impactful entrepreneurship or not? Then we looked at, well, does student debt affect high value entrepreneurship as we proxy it using venture-backed entrepreneurship? Turns out venture backing early investor support is lower when individuals with student loans start a company. It's not like somebody's looking at your personal portfolio and saying, well, you know, you should be, we should not be lending to you. Typically venture capitalists don't do that. You know, what I believe the effect comes from is that these startups are not necessarily of the nature that venture backing comes in at, which may be lower risk, you know, in lower tech industries. Individuals with student loans also have startups backed by lower profile VCs. You know, and if you're an entrepreneur, you would prefer a VC that can add more value, which would be high profile VCs. One of the interesting things that we do find is that student loan ventures of people who have, ventures of entrepreneurs with lower student loans have more employment conditional survival, which is similar to what we found earlier, but actually have lower survival rates, which is, and we interpret this as the notion that you're actually starting a more risky firm, but conditional on actually being successful, you're very successful, but otherwise you're going to actually fail more, which is the notion of taking more risk, basically. And these relationships are causal. I can talk about all day long about kind of the analysis that we do, but we use two national experiments, the higher education amendments of 92, which really kind of led to a boost in the uptake of student loans. The HE of 1998, which is really looking at folks that took on loans after the bankruptcy discharge became kind of universal, and all of those really helped us show the causal nature between student loans and entrepreneurship. The other piece of this, the second paper, we used the implementation of no loans financial aid policies by schools, which we believe are pretty unrelated to the kind of underlying reason for why somebody would start a company. And it was really interesting to find that as well. There was a relationship between a school which implements a no loans financial aid policy having a negative or having a positive impact rather on entrepreneurship. You know, for people who like pictures, well, just to take an example, right? If a school, this is 0.0, if a school implements a no loans financial aid policy, you know, the school that is implementing this, we call them treated schools. The schools that are not implementing them are called untreated. And you'll see that, you know, typically the fraction of students taking loans actually dips for the treated groups, so the no loans student financial aid policy is implemented, whereas the untreated group that keeps going up. And interestingly, for those same treated groups, this graph represents the entrepreneurship rate before and after the implementation of the no loans policy. That entrepreneurship rate actually goes up, which is kind of an interesting causal explanation for the fact is that student loans have an impact, a causal impact on entrepreneurship rates. We have thought very hard about why student loans can affect entrepreneurship. You know, when you're running a company, when you're starting a company, you don't know where the next cash flow is coming from. You don't know what the next cash flow is going to be. And if you have fixed obligation, you're essentially removing the limited liability barrier, which every startup universally depends on. That means that you're only going to lose the money you put in. And once you remove the limited liability barrier, what you're saying is, it doesn't matter if you don't have any money, but you still have negative cash flows. And as a result of that, you know, that increases the costs of running a company. As importantly, it increases the cost of experimentation. Literature has shown that ventures and startups really rely on the notion of being able to tweak, experiment with things, so that, you know, you never know what's going to work, what's not going to work when you're in a startup. And if you're trying to do that, you're going to have eventual short-term failures. Having that short-term liability of having to pay those student loans, you are in a situation where you can't do that. So I'm almost running out of time. I'll also add that, we don't find similar effects for auto loans, mortgages, and credit card loans. And again, happy to discuss this. This is an important topic, and thank you for having me.
Thank you, Karthik. And our last speaker is Awesta Sarkash.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. My name is Awesta Sarkash. I'm the Government Affairs Director for Small Business Majority. I want to thank the Foundation for inviting Small Business Majority here today to chat about this. Small Business Majority, we're a national small business organization that empowers America's diverse entrepreneurs to build an equitable economy. We engage our network of over 85,000 small businesses and 1,000 business and community organizations to advocate for public policy solutions and to deliver resources to entrepreneurs that promote equitable small business growth. Our deep connections with the small business community, along with our scientific research, really give us a focus on trying to educate the public about key issues impacting America's entrepreneurs, with a specific focus on advancing the smallest businesses and those facing systemic barriers and inequality. So as folks have already talked about here, we're all aware that this year has been especially challenging for small businesses. National research suggests that over 400,000 small businesses across industries have permanently closed, and thousands more are struggling to make ends meet. And then we actually had some recent polling that shows 22% of small businesses say their business operations are still on the decline and will continue to be on the decline without funding or market changes. So needless to say, this has impacted our country's entrepreneurship in addition to exacerbating debt among Americans. And of course, the two are inextricably linked. In terms of what we know, how is debt holding back borrowers' ability to start and operate small businesses? For us, we know that our research and advocacy work that student debt is hindering the ability to start and operate a successful business. So that includes the ability to access capital to launch or grow a business or an organization. It hinders their ability to hire staff, hinders their ability to have a retirement savings plan in place, or the ability to offer an employer-sponsored retirement savings plan, which a lot of small businesses want to be able to provide to their employees. It also hinders their ability to afford healthcare as well. Our survey in student debt showed that 48% of millennials with student debt who currently own or have plans to own a business say that their debt payments have impacted their ability to start a business. And then nearly 4 in 10 millennials who are interested in opening a business say their student loan payments affect their ability to do exactly that. Millennials still paying on student loans say that their student debt affects their ability to invest in an organization or hire new employees as well. Of those who are still paying off student loan debt, 43% of those who own or have current plans to start a business say that their debt affects their ability to invest in an organization, like I mentioned before, or even hire new employees. We have such a robust network of small businesses that we hear a lot from them about what they have to say on student debt. In general, I think what we're hearing is that once the student loan payment deferral ends this fall, small businesses will have less money that they can put back towards their business. As an example, a lot of the direct payments to Americans this and last year, we found that a ton of that money that small businesses received was just redirected to their business. And so same goes kind of here. We know that small business owners are going to have less money when those student loans pick up again to put towards their business. And so this is really critical for small businesses that are already on the brink of collapse because of the pandemic. We're also hearing that it's preventing small business owners from being able to grow their business and to hire employees. So we had a millennial entrepreneur in Ohio we work with who has shared that instead of hiring an employee to help her, she's working very long hours to try and make more money herself to be able to pay off her debt. So we have sort of this research that can point to its impact on entrepreneurship. And then we have these anecdotal examples as well. Finally, we know, as I've mentioned, it's affecting their ability to access capital, which is essential to starting, growing, and expanding your business. And already, because of the pandemic, accessing capital is even more challenging than it has before, and even more so for women and entrepreneurs of color. Small business owner Louisiana has shared with us that her debt to income ratio is so high, about $75,000 in loans that have accrued $10,000 in interest, that she's been denied business credit on multiple occasions. And this is putting her at an even more greater disadvantage as they face setbacks during the pandemic. So this whole conversation, student debt, all that sort of burden has ripple effects across the small business ecosystem and thereby the economy, which has obviously gotten worse because of the pandemic, and it's had lasting effects. We know that small businesses are obviously vital to the growth of our economy. If we didn't know that before the pandemic, we certainly know that now. They're creating and providing high quality and in-demand jobs and encouraging economic development and creating innovation in local communities and small businesses. That's exactly why small businesses are the backbone of our economy. The health of our small business ecosystem and our impact and their impact has really been showcased during this past year. And so when we look at recent graduates and younger workers, they are likely looking to obtain a job that can give them a running start on paying off their student loan debt. Larger corporations or government entities may have better incentives for this, whereas small businesses are not always able to compete. Additionally, that sort of ripple effect of the student loan debt can sort of be felt each time there's a failure to launch attitude towards a startup idea, or the small business shutters because of mounting debt and their student loans prevent them from accessing the business capital that they might need to sustain their business, hire employees, and then eventually grow. So we see this sort of exacerbated during this public health crisis. The May 2021 Bureau of Labor and Statistics reported that the number to be in terms of the businesses closed to be about 5.8%, well above the pre-pandemic rate of 3.5. And so, we know from our own research that small businesses are still facing closure. And so I want to kind of quickly take a note here, because I know I'm slowly running out of time, which is to talk about the racial inequities component of this related to Black and Latino student loan borrowers and federal relief programs. 800,000 earlier this year, 800,000 self-employed people who were behind on their student debt before the pandemic were ineligible or have the perception that they were ineligible for federal relief. We know from our own research that very few self-employed individuals applied for PPP, just 7%, and student loan default and delinquency has barred businesses from accessing the Paycheck Protection Program. For self-employed Black and Latino borrowers, they are much more likely to be behind in collections on their student loans than their white self-employed peers. Nearly 30,000 small businesses had flags thankfully removed due to delinquent student debt, allowing them to access those loans. But a lot of that was after the fact, a lot of when the dollars were already taken during the first rounds. We also know minority-owned businesses up to 20% or an additional 1,000 businesses accessing relief each day. Women-owned businesses are up 14%. All this to say that this is an important issue. And so as student loan debt continues to grow, Congress can pass a comprehensive loan forgiveness program, common sense program that basically clears the pathway for emerging and successful entrepreneurs. So, we feel SBA could also offer educational programs toward younger people who want to start a business. And that should also include helping them develop financial plans so that they can pay off the debt while also growing their business. I will stop there and just want to thank everyone and the Foundation for having us today, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Awesta, and thank you, Karthik, and thank you, Sandy, for covering all of these various points of this issue. And I would like to invite our audience to submit Q&A their questions in our Q&A section. And while we're waiting for the audience's questions, I have a few questions of my own. And I wanted to kind of circle back to Awesta's point about racial inequities when it comes to accessing PPP funding, and also any other intersectionalities that exist. So from your vantage point, are there any gender differences and other intersectionalities as they relate to the choice to start a business while having student loan debt? And have you heard from have you seen it in your research, or have you heard it from your constituents?
I think we know across the board that entrepreneurs of color and women entrepreneurs have greater difficulty accessing traditional capital because of discrimination. And so in knowing that, it only sort of exacerbates the existing debt that they have, or the types of capital that they're seeking to sort of expand and grow their business. Or, as we know, with the Paycheck Protection Program, a lot of the businesses that applied who were underfunded or who were denied, we heard some stories about folks who were being denied because of credit, which was not allowed, but that a majority of them were people of color. And so there's a lot of intersectionality between debt overall, accessing capital, and then how that reinforces existing debt among those entrepreneurs who happen to also have student debt.
Thank you, Awesta. Sandy, Karthik, do you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, no, I agree with Awesta's response to that. We know that minority individuals in general have a hard time with student debt. We know they also have a hard time on the capital side when they are entrepreneurs. And I think that the combination of the two is really terrible. I mean, it just makes it much harder for somebody to put together a company where they can, implement their ideas and also gain wealth in the process in the long term. I think that it's an important enough issue where, I did take some of Sandy's points about, how the IDR program can be addressed to address some of these inequities. And we do need to do more to address those inequities, both on the entrepreneurship side, but also on the student debt side. I'll give you one example. This is slightly veering away from the topic. I think looking at student loans, say within a recessionary cycle. So I have another paper looking at within a recessionary cycle, are the impacts on income, on employment, and all that stuff much higher for people with student loans, right? And we do know that in general, minority students have high student loan balance to begin with. They also have accrued interest, and their balances keep going up. So you can kind of draw that line, and I would like to see more action on that, certainly.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add that I think it would be hard to find an area of the economy where Black individuals, households don't face bigger barriers than others. I mean, it's just very clear that we face a real challenge in solving these problems, given the restrictions on race-based policies. So, we could come up with some ideas about what to do, and we might not be allowed to do them. But yeah, student debt obviously is a bigger problem for Black students than it is for others. They generally, if you come from a low, not just a low income, but a low wealth household, then you just have less of a safety net to fall back on. This is going to affect you. I mean, many of the problems that create problems for people paying for college or repaying their loans are similar to the problems that make it difficult for them to buy a house or start a business, which is that their families can't help them. They don't have, if 1 month they can't make their payments, they don't have anybody to ask to help them do that. So there's no doubt that the barriers are very different. The question is, how do you solve these problems? I mean, short of ending systemic racism and ending the racial wealth gap, which we need to be working for, but a long term, how do we find the short-term solutions while we're working as a society to solve the really bigger problems, I think, is the really challenge that we face right now.
Thank you. So we have several questions coming in Q&A. Thank you, our audience, for submitting these questions. One interesting question is, there are people who carry student loan debt but never actually earn a degree. So do you know how big of a problem this is in general and how this might impact entrepreneurship rates? And also, are there differences between those with degrees and those without in terms of entrepreneurship?
Let me just say, in terms of student debt, we know that not completing your credential is the biggest predictor of struggling to repay your loans, because we're talking about people who have started school and then don't have the earnings that are commensurate with a college education. Most of those people have very small student debts because they didn't stay in college for a long time. The people who have, $50,000 of student debt are people who were in college for a longer time. But we have a huge completion problem. And we clearly need to solve that problem and make the investments in education pay off better for people and help them to succeed. The relationship between those people and successful entrepreneurship, I think, is a really interesting question, and maybe somebody else knows more about.
What I'd like to say there is, I think we also have a measurement problem, which is, as a researcher, I can dig up different data sets and try to see do my best to match them all, but there's no comprehensive data set that a researcher can go to and say, well, are these particular characteristics affiliated with entrepreneurship rates? So as important as it is to kind of answer these policy questions, I think measuring them is equally or probably somewhat more important, because then you can actually make policy prescriptions. As an example, Survey of Consumer Finances, great resource, but it's at the household level, and I can measure student loans at the household level. I can measure whether they have completed the highest degree, but there are a lot of holdbacks. There's a lot of kind of difficulty in kind of assessing what kind of program, what kind of degree, what skills do they get, and I think we need to kind of start paying very good attention to how we put this information together, because once we do that, we can start actually talking about the results that can lead us to the right direction. But if I was to just posit an answer, I would agree with Sandy, right? Having no credential is a significant barrier in employment. We know employers cannot, many of them tick these boxes. Do you have something? Or do you have something? Maybe have skills, but I don't have a degree, and that can hurt you. Investors may look at those things and say, well, I look at an entrepreneur with a degree and without a degree, who would I want? And that to them represents something that they get, even though they can't measure the skills, right? And so in those ways, you can still get hurt as an entrepreneur trying to raise capital, trying to kind of set up a business as well.
Okay, Awesta, do you have anything to add to this that you want to?
I think they did a great job of summarizing everything. So I think that sounds good.
Excellent. Actually, I have a question, just my own question. As I was preparing for this panel, there are not a lot of studies that are looking specifically at entrepreneurship and student loan debt. I think maybe this issue is becoming more relevant, but when you look at a body of research that's available, that is looking at the link that the causal link that Karthik was talking about, and Sandy noted that we need to find counterfactuals, we need to get more information, and how do you do that? So could you talk a little bit about the gaps in research and the potential directions that we need to go toward in order to get enough information to inform our policy decisions? Because it seems that maybe some of the solutions are not coming through because we just don't have enough information.
Happy to get into that a little bit. When I started some of the research that I have now, I think the proportion of research and this is, by the way, this is in no way saying bad things about people doing research, but it's just the fact that you tend to migrate to research as a researcher where there's data. It's a simple fact, because you can't do research without data. When I started out, I think the IPO market was about 100. I want to say I could get this wrong, maybe 100 billion or 30 billion, in that range. And There are probably thousands and thousands of papers on initial public offerings. There's great data on that, and there's a really interesting set of interesting economic cycles. The student loan market, 1.4 trillion, and it really, if you just search on SSRN or Google Scholar, the number of papers looking at student loans was minuscule, and that's actually started to go up. There are some really good scholars out there that are doing some interesting work, but the barrier for researchers is, well, the scholars, and this is not an excuse, because if you can access great data, you can kind of access more administrative data. You can do a lot with it, and that's where you can really get some action and insightful research. And so, organizations like the Kauffman Foundation, I mean, I think we would love to see possibilities of a national survey. I think there is a national survey by some scholars right now on this topic, and ideally a longitudinal survey. Like, what you really want is to follow the same individual over time and see what the ups and downs have been. That is where you can really get a lot of the answers, because you can understand the dynamics. When were they cash constrained? When did they have more student loans? When did they default on the student loans? And did that lead to them scaling back on their business? But having, I mean, that's my wish list, honestly. I mean, if you ask me, I'll talk about this all day long. Having a consistent longitudinal data set would just completely blow open the space.
Yeah, I mean, clearly that's what we need, but it does seem to me that the government has to do this. I mean, the government has detailed data about student loan borrowers over time, but it doesn't allow researchers access to those data. That's a problem. If you were to start a national survey, I mean, the share of people in any survey who would potentially be entrepreneurs is going to be very small, unless you're surveying people who already have indicated entrepreneurial activity, and that's going to be a problem. So, there is a federal law against a national student unit record system. Some states have very good data that, you want to get people in high school and then through college and see how they finance college, and then see what happens to them in employment afterwards. So if we could do that at a national level, it would be very helpful. But I think research on some of those state data sets could be very helpful. But again, I think that it's not just about data, it's really about having a strong conceptual grounding, because again, it's just really clear that if you have student loans and somebody else doesn't, and they're otherwise similar to you, so you're controlling for all these variables, you're going to face, constraints that the other person doesn't face, because you have another obligation. Now, again, if you don't have to make your payments because you don't have any income, it could be a credit access constraint, but not a cash flow constraint, because you're not making those payments. So I think figuring out how you control for everything about the people, so that you can see that the difference is their student debt, without saying, okay, the difference is that you have less money. Does that mean you have less money? I mean, obviously you do. And I think that this family background question is just really critical, because so frequently you have this background question that is the reason why, so your parents gave you money for a down payment for a house and they paid for college. How do you sort those things out? And so I would say we need this better data, and we also need to really work hard on trying to figure out what questions we're asking and how we can best think about how to frame those questions and what meaning we can attach to the findings.
Go ahead, sorry, Awesta.
Oh, no, I was just going to say part of it too. I think that would be really important to sort of flip this on its head a little and ask questions like, for entrepreneurs who have been able to manage their student debt and manage their business, what specifically allowed them to do that successfully? So were they in touch with their local SBS SDs? Did they have access to some comprehensive and wraparound services that allowed them to adjust their budgets or adjust their business plans or so on, to be able to understand either the market or their financial situation? So we're not just looking at the problem, but we're looking at people who have managed to be successful as entrepreneurs in spite of having student debt.
Karthik, did you have something also to add?
I just wanted to highlight one fact. We're talking about student loans, but we should try and kind of get to the issue of why are student loans special? Why are they different than, say, credit card loans, auto loans, mortgages? I mean, in my mind, I would love to hear the rest of the panel. You're taking it on pretty early in your life. You don't have significant assets, perhaps. you also are taking an obligation which is not underwritten with your ability to pay. And finally, when you're taking student loans, it's hard to discharge those loans. And so a lot of these characteristics don't actually exist in any other type of loans. So in our data, we don't find any implications of car loans or credit card loans. And trying to understand why it is that student loans are causing these issues, in my mind, is as important. By simply saying just having a loan is going to impact your ability to do a startup by itself, that should be true for every kind of loan. Then why is it that student loans are different? I think, again, research has to be done more into that, but we could try to get to some of that in my research.
I think that's a really interesting question. And I think it's, again, a hard one to parse, because, for example, if somebody has a student loan and a car loan, they're going to pay their car loan because they don't want their car taken away. So how people prioritize those loans, both psychologically and in terms of payments, seems really important. The bankruptcy issue, it doesn't make any sense at all that it's so hard to discharge student loans in bankruptcy. But the solution can't be, just declare bankruptcy and get rid of your student loans. So even that's a policy that should change. It doesn't seem like the solution, because we don't want people to get to that point of having to declare bankruptcy. But it does seem like understanding. I mean, most people who have struggle with student debt also have other kinds of debt, like utilities debt, or if you look at it in the survey of consumer finances, people have looked at this and found that it's usually not only that debt, but it's got to be something, sort of a psychological difference in how people approach it. And I think people frequently think of it as the student loan debt as the marginal debt. Of course, I have a car loan, I need a car, so I wouldn't think that's causing me the problem. But you don't think, of course, I have student loan debt, I need it in education. You think, I did that a long time ago, and why is it that now I'm having to pay for it? Whereas you can still see your car in the driveway.
Thank you, Karthik, Sandy, and Awesta. We are coming up on an hour. We have a lot of very interesting questions, but very briefly, I was wondering if any of you had noticed any specific policy or law-oriented triggers, I guess, not triggers, but maybe even like mechanisms that are specifically student loan related that prevent entrepreneurs from getting their businesses started, or getting the support that they need. Because, for example, I'm specifically looking at the SBA issue where they had to lift the government, what is it called? The Debt Collection Improvement Act provision that prevents persons with student loan debt that is in default from accessing PPP loans. So those kind of little triggers within the public policy. Have you seen any additional items like that? And how, is there a list somewhere, and how can we look at it, especially in a context of the pandemic or an emergency? I
don't know if there's a list anywhere, but one issue is when you're applying for credit, how they look at your student debt. And there appears to be variation, even if you don't have monthly payments because you're an income-driven repayment and you have very low payments, are they looking at your payments, or are they looking at the amount of outstanding debt? And there's variation across lenders, I think, in that, and we could probably do something about that.
Something that comes to mind for me, well, one, I do think that there's an effort to shift how folks access capital or how debt is perceived. And I think there's some efforts in Congress, and again, I'm not sure that there's a list out there, but I think there's some efforts in Congress to reassess how folks access loans, or how lenders mitigate risk. If someone's credit score isn't great, but you want to be able to offer capital. So I do think that there is an effort there. The other side of this that I think is something that really impacts debt for everybody, but especially student borrowers who want to become entrepreneurs, is we still haven't passed the Truth in Lending Act for small business owners. Essentially, the Truth in Lending Act would stop predatory lending so that exorbitant interest rates aren't being charged among small businesses. And because there's such a lack of traditional lending for entrepreneurs of color and women because of discriminatory practices, a lot of those communities will go to alternative forms of lending, which may not always be responsible. And as a consequence, they can sometimes be unknowingly charged, unknowing on their part, charged, 200% APR. And if they'll default on the loan, terrible things can happen. And so for folks like that who already have student debt, the situation's just thereby even more exacerbated. And so it's one of the reasons why we're advocating pretty strongly with the Responsible Business Lending Coalition to pass the Truth in Lending Act federally to protect small business borrowers.
Excellent. Thank you all to our panelists for participating in this panel and trying to begin untangle the relationship between student loan debt and entrepreneurship and potential directions in research in this area. I will now hand it over to Jennifer Kelly Ventura to continue with the Policy Solutions panel. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Anya. Well, it's good to be with you all today. I'm Jennifer Kelly Ventura, and I serve as a program officer of policy at the Kauffman Foundation, where I manage a portfolio of grants and other programmatic activities designed to improve public policy for entrepreneurs. It's my pleasure today to be hosting this panel on behalf of the Kauffman Foundation to discuss policy considerations for entrepreneurs. So this panel will be discussing policy considerations for entrepreneurs and aspiring entrepreneurs with student loan debt. So today we're joined by 4 outstanding speakers. First, we'll hear from Mr. Seth Frotman, who is a founder and executive director of the Student Borrower Protection Center, which leads a nationwide effort to protect student loan borrowers and halt widespread abuses by the student loan industry. Before founding the Student Borrower Protection Center, Seth served as an assistant director and student loan ombudsman for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, leading the agency's work on student loan origination, servicing, debt collection, and oversight of for-profit institutions of higher education. Then we'll hear from Ms. Ashley Harrington, who is the Federal Advocacy Director and a Senior Counsel at the Center for Responsible Lending. Her portfolio includes general consumer lending issues with a particular focus on student debt and small business. At CRL, she assumed a lead role in federal advocacy efforts and was a primary negotiator for the Department of Education's 2017 to 2018 Borrower Defense and Repayment Rulemaking Committee. She has also served as the director of the National Social Justice Program at the United Negro College Fund, where she spearheaded work on the intersection of student debt and criminal justice reform. Then we'll hear from Dr. Marshall Steinbaum, who is a senior fellow in higher education finance, Jane Family Institute, and assistant professor of economics at the University of Utah. He studies market power in labor markets and its policy implications for higher education, student debt, and credentialization. He received his PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. And last but not least, we'll hear from Dr. Frederick Wherry, who's a Townsend Martin class of 1917 professor of sociology at Princeton University and director of the Dignity and Debt Network, a partnership between the Social Science Research Council and Princeton. He combines his early commitment to social justice with research on how people interact with money and the institutions that surround it. So before I turn things over to our speakers, again, I would encourage the audience to pop any questions they may have into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many of your questions as possible later in the program. With that, Seth, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, and thank you for hosting this amazing panel. So I was trying to think about what to say today when there's so many distinguished scholars after. So I really wanted to highlight kind of my own personal experience. And what that includes is, for nearly a decade now, traveling all throughout the country in big towns, little cities, everything in between, in state houses, in labor halls, on college campuses. I've had the privilege of talking to thousands of American families about student debt. And the first question that always comes up, regardless of the audience, is you hear about student debt on the TV, you read about it in the newspaper, you hear about it at with your friends. Is it really as bad as everyone makes it out to be? And my answer is always no, it's actually quite a bit worse than you even realize. And I think that the discussion today about the real impact that student debt is having across the small business sector is a significant window into both why that is the case, but I also think it's important because it shows how we got here. And I think one of the things that is often implicit, and sometimes you'll even catch this explicitly, is this sentiment that somehow the student debt crisis was some sort of accident or even a mistake. You know, how could this have happened? Nobody could have anticipated this. How could this have possibly gotten so bad? And that's just not true. I think one of the things that I always try to remind people is there are no trillion-dollar mistakes. The decisions that led us here were in the halls of Congress, in state houses, Democrats and Republicans, that allowed this to happen, and in many cases actually drove this to happen. And you know, we could debate for days and hours about kind of how we got here. But a lot of this premises on a couple high-level points: that student debt is somehow, quote, good debt, that where we find ourselves isn't really that big of a deal and not that many people are actually hurting. I'm sure you're going to hear from one of my colleagues about how this was a necessary mechanism to fill this pressing skills gap that America faces. This is a viable alternative to address budget deficits or drive needed revenue. And I obviously think, again, that all of these are horribly misguided. But I think what a lot of this really boils down to is a fundamental failure to understand both the true impact and the true cost that student debt has on individuals, their families, their communities, the economy, and our country. And what you see in this trillion-dollar mistake is that this isn't good debt. This isn't a viable alternative. What student debt actually is tinder on the fire of all that ails American families, their household finances, but even more so, what's cutting across American life and fraying the fabric across so many aspects of our society, from retirement insecurity, gaps in home ownership, educational decisions, even family formation. And then when you look across larger society, income inequality, outmigration from rural areas, the stark divide between urban and rural America, and of course, racial inequality and the racial wealth gap. And of course, for today's discussion, small business formation. And I think when I think of the challenges that student debt is forming in small business formation, it's not just a standalone issue. It's how the challenge is driving for entrepreneurs impacts all these other factors like rural and urban divide, wealth accumulation, and the racial wealth gap. So I think back to my original point, when state legislators were slashing higher ed budgets, when Congress stood by idly while they saw historic levels of student debt and tuition, does anybody really think that they contemplated how their actions would result in 2 million fewer small businesses, that their action or inaction would result in 1 in 5 young farmers not being able to access the capital to start a farm or invest in their farm? Of course not. What we see with student debt time and time again is overly simple, naive view that somehow this is good debt, that the college wage premium will always save us and solve all our problems, that it's not that bad, that the cost of student debt is somehow confined to what a borrower sees on their monthly bill, that if you don't have student debt, somehow it doesn't impact you or your life, or maybe the most nefarious, that this is just the problem of a bunch of millennials eating too much avocado toast in big city brunches. But I think when you actually take a deeper dive, and when you talk to small business owners and their advocates, you see just how disingenuous and dangerous these arguments are. So for the past months and years, and especially at the Student Borrower Protection Center, we've been hosting a series of events to hear more from small business owners and understand what their concerns and how student loan debt was impacting their lives. And I think what you hear just runs totally opposite to this idea that student debt isn't a larger problem or somehow the problems are contained. So a couple of few points that I've really learned from talking to small business owners, and some of this came up today in the earlier panel, is one, how student debt impacts every facet of starting and growing a business. and how for some students, some entrepreneurs who just weren't lucky enough to have family wealth and had to take on student debt, how it dramatically impairs their ability to start the business of their dreams, how they can't fathom how they could quit a job or enter a new career when they owe Navient $400 a month in every single month. And even we heard earlier today that, somehow there are borrowers who are fine, who can make their payments or get on an income-driven repayment plan. And we see how how misguided those arguments actually are, and how the problem here isn't just what shows up in your student loan bill, but how student loan debt hangs over all of your credit decisions. At the SBPC, we found how this impacted personal decisions, where people with the most amount of student debt paid $30,000 more across their financial life. From a mortgage to a credit card to a car loan. And you see the same thing happening in the business sector, how people who've been forced to take on student debt struggle to get access to capital from the SBA, from their local bank, to start a business or grow a business. I think another thing that talking to small business owners shoots down this idea is student debt only impacts people who have the debt. If you don't have student debt, you don't have to worry about it. We've talked to small business owners who have, especially in rural areas, who have a tremendous problem actually hiring and retaining employees, where they set up businesses, buy their home in local regional economies that just can't support a workforce where you have to pay people $600, $700 a month extra to afford to get their student loans. And they're losing out on the best talent as they try to compete in a global economy. And I think the third thing you really see by talking to small business owners is just how hard the student debt crisis is hitting rural small business owners. You see how family and young farmers struggle to start and grow their businesses. You see how even in rural healthcare, how doctors struggle to establish rural practices, imperiling the public health of our rural communities. And so I think I just wanted to close with this. I think until we are honest, transparent, and gain a better understanding of the true cost that debt is having, we really run the risk of continuing to dig ourselves into a further and further hole. And borrowers, families, small business owners will continue to struggle, and we will see the ripples across the economy and our country. And so I think the question for all of us is, how do we get policymakers to see the direct line that they are creating to the small business owners who are really struggling because of this debt? How their policies are impacting the creation of small businesses in their own backyard, and how they are driving their best talent out of their own constituencies. And until we actually recognize the true cost and we have to recognize the true cost today and tomorrow that student debt is having, and respond to those with significant and robust policy interventions, not only going forward, but also for the tens of millions who are currently drowning under this debt. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Seth. Ashley, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Great to be here today. And great to be on a panel with so many folks that I know and get to work with so often. I heard a lot of points that I want to make, and I'm going to reiterate today, and I will show some slides in a bit. But I just think it's important that we continue to emphasize something that Seth mentioned, that this is absolutely a crisis. This is absolutely a problem. $1.7 trillion and 45 million people is absolutely an issue that we should all be concerned about. And it absolutely impacts small business formation, family formation, people's ability to save for retirement, buy houses, contribute to the economy. And so in that way, it affects all of us in so many ways. And we can't continue to ignore that or just put Band-Aids on it, which is what we have done so often. I think you have to remember that it doesn't have to be this way. These are policy choices. And over 90% of the $1.7 trillion is federal outstanding debt. So this is absolutely a federal government problem. Like so much of the things in our society, so many of the inequities in our society, they are the result of actual policy decisions and or failures from the federal government or from the state government. And so these entities also have a big role to play in addressing that. We can't expect students and families and communities to fix problems that they did not create, and to fix systems that oppress them and that they also did not create. And we can't keep acting like that is going to happen with each new problem. Student debt is just the latest iteration of our failures to actually address the major inequities in our society. And so we have to look at it from that lens. So I think it's just always important to start there, and always important to remember and to start from the perspective of, we have a persistent racial wealth gap in this country. We know exactly where it comes from, right? It comes from the fact that Black people went from being wealth as slaves to trying to create wealth in a system that literally prevents them at every turn from doing that. There's a reason why Black people have 1/10 of the wealth of white folks, while Latino families have 1/8 of the wealth of white folks, and that this is not a gap that is closing. And it's a gap that extends to people even if they're college educated, even if they have graduate degrees. And so we have to talk about it from there. Too many times we don't put things in that context. We also fail to account for the fact that income and wealth are not the same. We cannot just say because someone has a certain income or a high income, or what we would consider to be a high income, they should be fine. And we shouldn't create policies that also help them, when we know that we also have an issue with people's inability to create and then pass on wealth. In fact, we're having Black and brown families having negative wealth, and that is not changing. And so we have to, again, always consider these nuances when we're thinking about policy solutions and addressing these problems. I think you've heard a lot of stats today. I think it's really important to just talk a little bit more and give you some more in-depth facts about the Black student debt crisis and the Latino student debt crisis. Black students are more likely to borrow more and to struggle in repayment. That goes directly back to the wealth gap, to families of color, to Black families not being able to buy houses, right? And then when they do buy houses, it's at higher interest rates when they have access to credit. They can't get access to credit through traditional lenders. You had FHA redlining for decades. You have the Black homeownership rate being the same as it was even before the Fair Housing Act was created. You had communities of color losing $1 trillion of wealth during the Great Recession, wealth that has never been regained. And all of this is happening before we even get to the COVID pandemic that is also disproportionately impacting Black and brown communities. So we didn't even enter the current recession and pandemic in the same place. Black and brown communities were very much still behind. They had not recovered from the Great Recession, and now we're compounding all those issues. And then we get here and we have, Black college graduates are even more likely to default than white dropouts. That's a problem. They're more likely to be preyed upon by for-profit colleges. They're more likely to just, over 40% of the class that entered in 2003, 2004 had defaulted by 2016. And up to 70% of that class was already projected to default by 2024. That's before we got to COVID. So we can't even imagine that this is gonna get better. It's only gonna get worse. We came into COVID in general, almost 1 in 4 borrowers being in default or serious delinquency. People are defaulting on their student loans at a higher rate than any other form of consumer credit. This is a problem. If any other thing, it was $1.7 trillion, would you add this much default, this many people not ever to pay it back, something would be done about it. The Department of Education should not be one of the biggest banks in the country, because that's what we're looking at with a $1.7 trillion portfolio. And then you get to this, to how people build wealth or can't build wealth in this country, right? And that's absolutely supposed to be what small business ownership was supposed to lead to people being able to build wealth. Home ownership, higher education itself was supposed to help people get access to a better life and financial security. But if you can't do that because we have a debt finance system that perpetually keeps people here, then we've effectively put them in a rock and a hard place, right? you have to go to college, because most of the good jobs since the Great Recession have gone to people with some form of post-secondary education. So we tell people you have to go to college. You have to go to college to get these higher incomes. And there is still an income premium, but that is also different across races, right? So we know that. But then once you get those incomes, the debt you have to take on is so unmanageable that your income doesn't actually translate to that financial security, to a better life. And so we should all be concerned about that. We should all be concerned that we are trying to have a highly educated population, which benefits everyone, but that highly educated population doesn't get to give back to society the way that they would want to, and that the way we would want to as taxpayers, right? As folks who are part of this economy and part of this society. So I think we've talked a little bit about how all these things are connected, but I think the Paycheck Protection Program is perhaps the most incredible and recent example of how these things are interconnected. So I'm going to show a slide, because we looked at the issue that the last panelist talked about in terms of how the Paycheck Protection Program was connected to student loans. But so one of the qualifications on the Paycheck Protection Program, the application literally said, have you ever been are you currently delinquent or in default on a federal student loan? And if you are, you were not qualified to participate in this program. And so when you look at this slide, you see that we talked about the 30,000 applications that were held up. So that's up to 800,000 individuals who have reported delinquency or default in the last federal SHED survey. And so these are folks who, even if they didn't actually get a hold in their application, thought that they were not going to have access to this federal relief program, this $800 billion program that was meant to help small businesses survive the current recession and pandemic. There are all kinds of problems with PPP. We can get into that if you want to. The issues with the structure of the program, which lenders participated, how people had access, rules that didn't make sense when we look at what small businesses look like in this country. This is just one piece of the problem with PPP, but I think it's important because it illustrates how all of these systems are connected. And so when you have 800,000 people potentially being shut out of a federal program in the midst of a pandemic and recession, we should all be concerned. We also know that there were disproportionate numbers of Black and Latino borrowers who fall into this category. Almost 500,000 self-employed borrowers of color fell into this category and potentially did not have access to the Paycheck Protection Program. Again, this is on top of all of the other issues with that program. And while this came to light for PPP, because this was such an unusual situation, this $800 billion program, we're in the midst of this pandemic, we're all in our houses and our economy and society never looks the same again. And literally people, and it's a public health crisis and literally people are dying. It's important to remember, this wasn't a new thing, right? Already SBA had a requirement that if you were in delinquency or in default on a federal student loan, you couldn't get access to SBA loans. And SBA had problems with their SBA loans before PPP. They already had disparities in access, right? 3% and 9% and 6% of loans went to Black and brown businesses in the major SBA program, the 7A loan program, before we even got to PPP. People were already being shut out. And it wasn't just SBA. This is a program this is also something that was happening with any federal loan program, the FHA loan program, which is how most Black and brown borrowers have to get access to home ownership because the conventional financial mainstream market doesn't serve them. We've never had equal access to credit and opportunity in this country. And yet, if you were in default on delinquency or a federal loan, if you had ever had that, you could have your FHA application held up. And so again, you're not able to build wealth because you can't get access to federal government guaranteed business loans. You're also not able to build wealth because you can't get access to federally government guaranteed housing loans. And the other market is not well serving you. We know the conventional market also didn't serve small business owners of color. So it's a never ending cycle. And so we worked with groups to get that change. We were very excited to have that no longer be a barrier. It was also a barrier, not just in the default and delinquency, but how agencies were looking at DTI. I think Sandy mentioned on the last panel how different lenders address how they look at student loans, whether they look at the amount or how much you pay. FHA was one of the last federal agencies. So you have, federal home mortgages that are backed by Fannie and Freddie, the GSEs are backed by the VA or USDA. When they looked at people's student loans, they would go by their income-based repayment plan amount to determine DTI, which determines how much house you can afford. If you can afford a house at all, if you're ever able to get to that down payment and you live in a place where houses are affordable, which many of us don't anymore. But FHA was using 1% of the overall balance. Not even if you had a $0 payment or a $200 payment, they weren't using that to create your DTI. They were using 1% of your overall balance, which again, Black borrowers are more likely to borrow more and to watch their balances grow over time because of the income discrimination and labor market discrimination. So the one avenue that they had to home ownership, if they didn't have default or delinquency, now they're using the wrong metric to determine whether they can actually even qualify for a mortgage. And they're just being shut out again. So these issues are systemic. Luckily, just announced yesterday that was changed. FHA is going to do what Fannie and Freddie and the USDA do. So that's very exciting. But these are, these are Band-Aids, right? We have a major problem that can only be addressed if we actually cancel some of the debt. And so this is about the new rules and the 30,000 holes that were cleared up. And so I know we're supposed to talk about solutions, so I want to talk a little bit about those. One thing that's going on right now is that most folks who have federal loans, their payments are on pause and they're not set to resume until October. And I know for me and many folks I know, this has been a lifesaver, right? This payment pause has been amazing. It's been amazing the things that you were able to do, but it's also been amazing to realize what student loans really do to your every day-to-day life. Like, we knew these things, but you can actually see that play out when you don't have that monthly obligation. And so Seth and my organization, last organization I think are on this call, are supporting extending that payment pause, but we're also supporting starting with broad-based cancellation. We are supporting executive action to cancel $50,000 of student debt per borrower, because we can't begin to address this system. We can't begin to help student loan borrowers if we don't do something about these balances. They have to go down. $1.7 trillion is just not sustainable for them or for the economy. And so we have to cancel at least some of that debt. We want to start with $50,000. Then once we do that, we can do the rest, right? We can make it more affordable. We can fix income-based repayment. We can simplify the system. We can hold servicers accountable. We can invest in HBCUs and MSIs. We can increase grant aid and make college debt-free. We can increase accountability for for-profits. And obviously, throughout all of this, we should be thinking about how we address the systemic issues and connections that create and exacerbate the racial wealth gap, which the student loan debt is absolutely a part of. And that's providing access to capital, credit, and resources to people who have historically been denied. But we have to start somewhere. I think absolutely we have so many problems in this society. But that doesn't mean we just don't do anything until we find the big one solution that's going to fix everything. If you cancel $50,000 in student debt, you would cancel the debt of over 75% of borrowers, of federal borrowers, over 95% of those who are in default. That is life-changing for so many people in so many communities. We can't knock that. And then we can do other things, and we can do other things simultaneously. We're asking for this by executive action. The president himself can literally direct the Secretary of Education to cancel this debt and do something about this, because this is federal debt. Meanwhile, Congress can do their job and enact debt-free college and do something about the other side, so we can help future borrowers and current borrowers at the same time. These don't have to be conflicting ideas. Addressing systemic issues don't have to be conflicting ideas. I think the other thing that we learned last year with the Paycheck Protection Program and the CARES Act and stimulus package is that the federal government can do a lot of things very quickly when they want to. I don't think before last year anyone thought the federal government could get out all those stimulus checks in like 3 weeks. And yet they did, right? There were still problems with delivery, but they got out all those checks. They turned around so many things. They deployed $800 billion. Again, none of it was perfect, and so much of it is not going to be perfect. But no, we don't have enough time. 45 million people don't have time to wait for us to figure out how to make it perfect. They want us to figure out how to make it better. And these are ways that we can make it better. And it starts with cancellation. It starts with across the board cancellation. It can't be targeted. We can't put up barriers. Anytime we put up barriers for people to access relief, we end up leaving out some of the people that we really actually wanted to get relief. We see that with income-based repayment. We see that with public service loan forgiveness. We see that with every single program. We saw that with the Paycheck Protection Program. We see that every time we try to make poor people prove they are poor or make people prove that they are deserving of some type of aid. Meanwhile, we didn't make anyone prove they deserve the $1.7 trillion Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. We just did it. And so we can make choices and we can decide what our values are and who we want to help. And it won't just help them. It will put billions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars back into the economy. Income inequality, wealth inequality, it is costing all of us. The student debt crisis, it's costing all of us. Now, on the last panel, also folks were wondering other things that we advocate for on not just for student loans, but for small business. So I'll just name a couple of those as well. So we have been advocating that federal regulators increase transparency and access. The federal banking regulator should be holding the banks that they supervise accountable for whether they are serving all small businesses in all communities equitably. They should be more transparent about that. They should be encouraging them to serve them and having access. The CFPB should be actively looking at this, and they are. So right now we're waiting for a rule under Dodd-Frank 1071, which will literally have small business lenders reporting on who they are serving by race and ethnicity and how they are serving them. We are 10 years old. That was Dodd-Frank. We're 10 years overdue for that. If we had had that rule before Paycheck Protection Program, we would have way more data right now. And we would have a way easier way of actually showing how inequitable this program was. So we need a robust 1071 rule. We need an Office of Fair Lending at SBA. I think it's absolutely ridiculous that SBA was already doing poorly on equitable access and equitable lending. And that's because it was no one's job to actually look at their programs and evaluate them and evaluate whether they were actually well serving everyone. And we all know that if it's no one's job, is it actually going to happen? Most of the time, no. So there needs to be an Office of Fair Lending at SBA that looks at and thinks about these things, that thinks about how different program requirements or program rules or ideas are actually going to impede certain groups from accessing relief and from accessing federal programs. Increased support for community development financial institutions and minority depository institutions. These institutions have historically done the best job of serving communities of color and small business owners of color and veteran-owned businesses, women-owned businesses, all of those. They make that a part of their mission. And we also saw that in PPP. But many of them have low levels of capital. They haven't received the number of investments and resources. For the MDIs, they have the same wealth gap that families of color do. So we need to invest and support them in very real and significant ways. And we need to incentivize the private sector to work with more small businesses and to work with ones who they haven't traditionally worked with. All of these things are a part of the effort to help student loan borrowers, small business owners, but I think everyone will benefit from a lot of these policies.
Thank you so much, Ashley. I really appreciate that presentation. Next, I'll turn it over to Marshall.
Okay, so this has been a very interesting set of presentations so far. I'm going to talk a bit about some of the research that we've been doing at the Jane Family Institute, which researches higher education finance. I'm a senior fellow there, and we've gotten some credit reporting data that enables us to investigate the effects of the student debt crisis, including potentially on entrepreneurial activity. So I'm going to start off by framing, basically how I see the student debt crisis. A couple of years ago, I wrote a paper also for the Kauffman Foundation, interpreting declining entrepreneurship that we saw throughout the 2010s, and that Karthik showed the time series of in his presentation. Interpreting that as part of the erosion of worker bargaining power, basically interpreting entrepreneurship as a rung on the job ladder. And we knew from lots of labor economic scholarship that happened during and after the Great Recession that the job ladder had eroded for young workers at that time. And I think part of that overall phenomenon is the fact that they're less able to start small businesses. Of course, Karthik also made the apt point that just because we see these twin time series of rising student debt and declining entrepreneurship doesn't necessarily mean one causes the other. But I do think that we have some data, including the findings that Karthik himself showed, that that these things are in fact related. And if I had to kind of hazard a guess as to why student debt in particular, as opposed to other types of debt, has seemingly disastrous impact on wealth building over the life cycle and these other pathologies, it's basically because of the sort of selection into who's likely to have student debt and the demographic characteristics and economic characteristics of the population of student debtors. That this is basically something that we have introduced into the economic life cycle for people who are young in the last couple of decades. That wasn't a feature of the American landscape prior to this, both because college was far more affordable. The cost of higher education was on public agencies and state governments more so than on individuals. So the people who were likely to go to college, who might also be the people who are likely to start small businesses, wouldn't have had student debt as part of that. And secondly, because there are people, we basically cause more people to associate themselves with the higher education system, and that means, given that it's so much more expensive, that they're taking on student debt to do that, especially a diverse population of what we might call marginal students. That is to say, people who might not have gone to college had they been born in a previous generation, but are going to college because they're part of younger generations. And that is basically what I'm referring to when I say that the student debt crisis is product of declining worker bargaining power. So in terms of solutions, my basic point here is that, which I think has been pretty much already made by some of the other panelists, that income-driven repayment, which is kind of the consensus solution to the student debt crisis, that's the reason why we don't have to do anything else besides IDR, that's just not an adequate solution. And it's particularly not an adequate solution when you consider the issue of declining entrepreneurship, because the reason why people are able to have this ability to become entrepreneurs is because they have the wealth and status within the economic life cycle that they imagine, and basically student debt is eroding progress towards that, and it's getting worse. So income-driven repayment reduces your payments, but it increases your balances, and so that is basically putting the idea of entrepreneurship further and further out of reach, farther into the economic life cycle, if ever, for a wider and wider share of the population. And this is these are, I would guess, the people who, in the counterfactual world where higher education was not, the cost of it was not imposed on individuals, those are the people who would be starting small businesses. Okay, so here again, I'm relying on this credit reporting data that we've gotten at the Jane Family Institute. Here, what you're looking at, so the data consists of 10 years so far, 2009 to 2019, of, in this case, 1 million borrowers a year, student loan borrowers a year between the ages of 15 and 34. And then we've matched that to income and race at the census tract level. So basically we're saying we can't see in the credit reporting data what income you have or what race you are, but we can see what census tract you live in. And so we're imputing the race and economic characteristics of the census tract to the individual. So, obviously that's not a perfect imputation, but there's lots of residential segregation in the United States. And so this makes geographic characteristics a good proxy for race and economic data. So here, what you see, this is the beginning and the end of our sample, 1 million borrowers a year in 2009 and 2019. And you can see, as Sandy referred to in her presentation, there's an upward sloping line here, meaning that higher income, at least if we take a census tract as a proxy for income, correlates with higher loan balances. However, everyone has increased their student debt, I guess, except for the people who live in the richest census tracts. Everyone's increased their student loan balances by a lot in this intervening 10 years. So this is not a sign of like a small portion of the population. That was the implication of this idea that student debt is disproportionately held by a small number of high balance borrowers. That's true. We'll see that in a second, but that doesn't mean that that's a small portion of the population understood according to income. That rising student debt is a sort of universal phenomenon across the income distribution here. So again, this is the sort of stylized fact. The project that I'm working on now is basically asking the question, to what extent is the Great Recession, the labor market recession that happened in 2007 to 2009, responsible for this rise in imbalances? And what you can see here, so basically this we're testing the effect of the Great Recession year by year in our data. This is now a panel to get to what Karthik was talking about the importance of having longitudinal data following individuals over time. So we're looking at people who were student debtors in 2009 and saying, were the people who were most affected by the Great Recession different in terms of their student loan related outcomes after the Great Recession or following the Great Recession compared to people who were less affected by the Great Recession. And these coefficient points that are plotted on this chart year by year, basically comparing people who were more affected by the Great Recession to people who were less affected by it. So zero, you can think of zero as being the effect of the Great Recession on people who were less affected by it. And then the fact that these plots are not zero suggests that the people who were more affected by the Great Recession were more accumulated more student debt thereafter. And this is the effect of the Great Recession is growing year by year. So this paper takes as its inspiration work on what's called the hysteresis effect of the Great Recession. How long did people suffer in the labor market for having lived in a place that was more affected by the Great Recession in 2009? That tends to show, long-term employment reductions, long-term earnings reductions lasting into the 2010s. But the most recent findings in that vein basically show the effect of the Great Recession kind of dissipating in the late 2010s, and in some cases disappearing by 2017. That's not the case for student debt. So the effect of the Great Recession, at least our data goes through 2019, gets worse and worse over time. The people who were most affected by the Great Recession in 2007, 2009, the effect of that on their student loan balances has continued to accumulate thereafter and shows no sign of dissipating, quite the opposite. So this is basically maps that. This particular project, we haven't focused on race thus far, but I would point out there's definitely a racial characterization to this, basically showing that the places where individuals have taken on the most debt since the Great Recession tend to be heavily African American in a lot of cases. This is basically that sort of like racial interpretation is confirmed by this chart. So here again, we're proxying for individuals' race by the census tract in which they live. And this is back to the cross-section data, basically comparing change in income by census tract to change in student debt by census tract between 2009 and 2019. And you can see there's this divergence. So if the idea is student debt is supposed to cause you to have a higher income and thus enable you to pay it off, income or student debt is skyrocketing, especially for racial minority groups, but income, there was a declining income throughout the early 2010s thanks to the lingering effects of the Great Recession. It started to turn around in the late 2010s, but nowhere near sufficiently to make it the case that people who took on all of the student debt in that intervening period would now have enough income to pay it off. So this is why it's sort of like not, putting a band-aid on the problem is not going to solve it. Like these gaps are getting larger over time, rather than smaller. You would need income to be growing faster than student debt now in order to counteract the effect of student debt growing faster than income in the past, and that's just not happening. Here, this speaks directly to a point that Sandy made about the question of who has student debt, who has small amounts of student debt versus large amounts of student debt, and what income they have. So this is just the number of borrowers. This is in our sample. So of the million people per year in our sample, we're basically breaking it down by the total student loan balance and then plotting that by census tract median income. So you can see here, confirming what Sandy said, that the lowest balance borrowers, those with less than $15,000 of outstanding student debt, are the most numerous. And you can see that especially in the middle of the income distribution is represented by census tract median income. On the other hand, the people who have the highest total balance, $75,000 or above, they account for the largest share of the total student debt. The place where this is not consistent with what Sandy was saying is look at where in the income distribution the people with a high balance live. It's not in the richest areas. It's in fact in, I guess you could say lower middle class if you're just dividing into the four buckets of the that we did in this chart. It's people who live in, not, in places that have a median income between $20,000 and $40,000. So this idea that because the logical error here is, because there's a positive correlation with income and balance means that the people that have high balances must be high income. That's not necessarily the case. The people who are high income tend not to have high balances because they don't have student debt. They don't need student debt. They tend to come from more advantaged backgrounds and so you can see all the way on the right in this chart, they don't account for a very large share of outstanding student debt. So finally, I want to conclude by speaking a little bit about repayment. So I've talked about differential balances in the first place. A big part of the student debt crisis is not just that people take on larger and larger balances at the front end, but they have more and more problem paying them back on the back end. And this is, basically the direct effect of IDR. If our policy for dealing with difficulty repaying student debt is, okay, we'll lower your payments, to be some percentage of your income, even for the people for whom that system works, and it's not so easy to qualify and to remain enrolled in the program, that means that your balances are rising over time. So what this chart looks at loans by vintage. That's what the years on each line mean. It's the loans that were originated in a given year, looking X years following the origination of those loans. So 2008 in the lower right of the chart, that's the year for which we have the largest span of time since origination. So 11 years since then, you can see rising share of loans that have a higher balance now than they did at origination. So you think, the whole point of student debt is you're supposed to take on the debt and then pay it down. Instead, a lot of people take on the debt and then the balance accumulates because they're in IDR or for possible other reasons. This is individual loans, but you could take out further loans. Basically, we don't see people making progress towards repayment. We see decreasing progress towards repayment, both within each of these vintages and then across vintages. So like the left axis or at the left side of the chart, where the amount of progress towards repayment is getting worse and worse vintage by vintage of loan. And this is, basically suggesting that like the problem of non-repayment is accumulating, not going away. And that's certainly what we find, again, going back to this recession experiment. Here, the outcome of interest is basically how likely are you to have repaid the loan that you had outstanding in 2009. Part of the context here is all of our borrowers have student debt outstanding in 2009. So we're looking after that, now we're 10 years after that, basically how, or at least in the 2019 data, that's the most recent we have, how likely is it that people have made progress towards repayment? And we do, obviously, plenty of people who had student debt outstanding in 2009 have repaid their loans or repaid a good portion of them. But there's a differential impact of the Great Recession on that non-repayment. So basically, people who were most directly affected by the Great Recession in 2007 to 2009 have manifested less progress towards repayment in the intervening years. And this is a map of that, which is more or less geographically the diametric opposite of the previous map I showed you about loan balances. So yeah, I guess I should, I said IDR wasn't a sufficient solution. I should say, I'm strongly in agreement with what Ashley was saying about student debt cancellation being necessary. I think, there's not a great willingness on the part of higher education policymakers to recognize that this entire kind of experiment has not worked out. It was supposed to be, more people will go to college, they'll finance it with student debt. It's okay to shift the cost of college away from the public sector and onto individual shoulders because the increase in income will make people able to repay that. And that if that's how you think the labor market works, I'm sorry to say the reality has disproven that theory.
Thanks so much, Marshall. We appreciate that presentation. And last but not least, I'll turn things over to Fred Wherry.
Yes, so I should also add my thank you for the invitation today. And so what I'm going to try to do is I'll make a few introductory remarks. I'll show a few findings from a paper that is authored with two scholars from University of California, Merced, Charlie Eaton and Laura Hamilton, and with my colleague here at Princeton, Adam Goldstein. What you'll see in those findings is, and this is the paper that came out with Roosevelt Institute a couple of weeks ago, we're finding what Marshall and Pinto and Steinbaum found, and that we're showing that the notion that student debt is somehow, if you cancel it, you're just helping people who don't need it. That's not what we're finding. We're also seeing a big sort of disparate racial impact of student debt. And so I'll show that to you. Because of the limitations on time, if you want to sort of see more or know more about what we did or how we did it, then you can go to the paper. The code and everything else is up on GitHub, so you can closely interrogate all of the decisions that we made. And so let me just say that, let me also say that if you haven't seen Marshall's paper that just came out this morning at Urban Institute, you should go run and find it. It's an excellent read. So I started out by trying to sort of think through the problem and how we're talking about student debt cancellation. And the reason I'm having a problem with it is that this is a program that the federal government created, and it went off the rails. And so now we're in a situation where you're basically it's almost like the housing crisis. The banks are selling a loan to these student borrowers, and in a number of cases for a house that they know will not appreciate. But they're willing to sell it because they know that the borrower is going to be on the hook. It's going to be very difficult to try to discharge the loan. And the lender basically says, you know, I don't need to take a haircut or run any risk by extending this loan. And so here we're in a situation where the federal government has done something that went wrong. And I think that the federal government, the president, should offer an apology for the things that have gone wrong. And so we should stop talking about using words like handouts and start using words like of apology and atonement. The second thing that I'll say is if you think about what the experience of student loan borrowers is, what that experience has been, it's a bit shocking. If you go to the complaints database at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and I sat with my team at Princeton, and we downloaded over 4,000 complaints just to get a sense of what was happening with student loan complaints. What you're seeing are debtors who find themselves being, once they're well in default, they're finding themselves encountering these debt collectors who are calling them, issuing threats that the sheriff is going to arrest them and put a padlock on their front door. They are being treated with acute disrespect. And in this one case that I show here, there was a woman, she had her phone on speaker as she was driving. Her daughter overhears this interaction with the debt collector. The daughter starts crying because, you know, her mother's being cursed at, and this man is calling her mother a loser. And for me, this is also concerning when people are getting called at work and they're noting that their boss has had to have several talks with them because these debt collectors who are calling about their student loan debt are calling them at their places of employment. And sometimes they're calling and they're saying things like, we know she's there, put her on the phone. And so when we're thinking about how student loan debt, especially when people are unable to repay, how that shows up in a person's life and how that might affect their prospects for entrepreneurship or any other types of advancement, then we should be thinking about the lived experiences of the debtors. The other thing we should be thinking about is that, you know, 6 years after starting college, if you're white or Asian, then, you know, 62% of you will have gotten a degree. And so even if you have student loan debt, at least you've got the degree along with it. By contrast, if you're Black, then 60% of you 6 years after starting college, you don't have a degree. So you may have, and so you can carry your student debt without having the degree. And you're likely to be have about twice as much debt as your white counterparts. And so this notion that there's not some kind of difference by race is something that we need to make sure that we sort of correct. And also keep in mind that 27% of Black adults are paying on student debts. The other thing too, and you'll see here, Seth and others on a panel at Princeton with the Dignity and Debt Network, when we were talking about the student loan crisis, And we're seeing that, after you leave college, for some, the debt is growing, and for others, it's going down. And so the perspective that people bring to this about how big of a problem it is, whether or not it is also a matter of racial justice, is one that that really should attend to these numbers. I bring up Steinbaum here. He has said enough for himself, so I'll just go quickly to this figure. So one of the things that happens is that if you're looking at household wealth, and you're thinking, if you forgive $50,000 in student loans, you're going to give it to people who don't need it. It's easy to sort of make the mistake that that the people, even those who are on the higher income portion, they tend to be Black. And so why is it that you have more Blacks who are higher income, but who would be benefiting from student loan cancellation? Well, it's simply because they didn't have the intergenerational wealth to keep them from having to take out as much debt. And so it stands to reason that even though they may have similar educations, occupations, and even income as some of their white counterparts, they're also going to be sort of having a lot more education debt at that higher income level. The other thing to keep in mind is just how much the student loan crisis has contributed to the racial wealth gap. And when we look at policies that are calling for cancellation, we note that this would be rather progressive, because Black borrowers in the bottom 10% of wealth receive over 30 times more debt cancellation than borrowers in the top 10%. And white and Latinx borrowers in the bottom 10% of wealth receive 20 times more debt cancellation than those in the top 10%. And so part of what we do in this paper, and given that we have 5 minutes left, is we just kind of go through, note what we call some of the empirical and conceptual errors in this in the debates about debt cancellation, and we just offer some corrections. We've already heard from others about what assets can unleash. And from the first panel, we've seen the causal effect on entrepreneurship. But I also would try to train our attentions just to the lived experience of what it means to be in this kind of debt and to be without protections. And with that, I will I'll open it up.
Yeah, thank you so much for that presentation. We really appreciate it. Yeah, like you mentioned, we are running at the top of the hour, so I don't think we're going to get to a whole lot of questions, but maybe if we could do just like one quick lightning round with everyone before I hand it back to Anya. So you all kind of talked about the impact of that the student loan deferment so far has had on both students, Black and Brown, entrepreneurs or would-be entrepreneurs. So what do you all foresee happening after September 30th, especially as it relates to entrepreneurs who might have been redirecting those funds that they typically would have used for student loan payments to their business? And second question, do you think Congress will take any action on student loan debt between now and the end of September? I'll open it up for 30 seconds from each of you. You can try to keep it brief.
I think first we hope that it doesn't end September 30th and that it gets extended. And we just released a letter today, and there are a number of lawmakers also calling for the extension of the payment pause, both because we are not out of the woods on this recession and pandemic, and many folks are very far away from being at pre-COVID levels, which weren't equitable anyway. So we're all, I think, advocating to extend that payment pause. I think right now, we're also still advocating for executive action on cancellation. We don't want to go through Congress, and we don't have to go through Congress. And Congress kind of has a lot on its plate right now, trying to do this whole infrastructure thing. And right now, the Department of Education has just kicked off the beginning of the negotiated rulemaking process that's going to cover a lot of issues from accountability to repayment. And so that is absolutely very important. There's a lot of reform that needs to happen to this system. But I think all of our hope is that we wait to restart repayments until we actually reform the system and we actually do some cancellation. You know, we want executive action. President Biden talked about student borrowers on the campaign trail. He talked about cancellation. We have the support of many members of Congress, including the Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, for executive action on cancellation. So that is the push, and that is the hope that we get there. That there continues to be, you know, work like everyone on these panels is doing to emphasize, you know, what student borrowers look like, what they're going through, and how that is not going to magically get better on October 1st. Things are, we're not going to people aren't going to magically have the money that they lost from, you know, the job and from unemployment, from underemployment, from the medical bill that they're carrying, from the stuff that they're dealing with their families and their communities. So that money doesn't magically come back. And so we have to act as though that it's not going to come back and it already was bad. And so how do we do better going forward?
Yeah, thank you for that, Ashley. Fred, Seth, or Marshall, anything to add real quick?
I'll just go really quick. You know, I think there's a desire among some to argue, you know, we're back, you know, the dark days of COVID are over, and the policies that got here have been enacted. But I think we need to remember for student loan borrowers that, you know, February and March of 2020 were bad. Like the flip side of the promises made were that we were going to build back better. And just turning on payments and throwing 40 million borrowers into a system that was ripe with abuse, corruption, and really let individual families, small business owners down isn't a victory. And I think there needs to be considerable progress before we talk about borrowers getting, you know, a student loan check every month again.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. I just add on what's to Seth, just a little historical note. In 1965, a year after the Civil Rights Act, that's when we saw the Guaranteed Student Loan Program getting signed. And so I would hope that given that Biden has signed the Juneteenth legislation, that he will not be long in thinking about sort of how the government might right some other wrongs.
I was just going to say that it strikes me that a lot of the kind of higher education policy world has moved towards taking as given the idea that payments are going to be restarted, but saying that we should essentially automatically enroll everyone who's now back in payment in income-driven repayment rather than making them, kind of newly apply for that the way it was prior to the pandemic. So it's sort of like pandemic payment pause is over, but IDR is the solution that will step in to that. And that's definitely not going to solve the entrepreneurship problem. I mean, I think there's kind of this idea that we can just sort of like stealthily transition to everyone being in IDR and having their balances rise all the time. And I don't think that that is going to be a long-term solution either. I mean, we're just going to worsen the repayment crisis and, show up all of the negative effects on the racial wealth gap and everything else that we've all been talking about if that's the way this goes.
Yeah, thank you for that. And thank you again to all our panelists for joining us. Unfortunately, I know we could keep talking about this for probably another hour at least, but I'm going to turn it back over to Anya.
Thank you, Jenny, and thank you everybody on the second panel and on the first panel to engaging in this very important conversation that is, I know, very sensitive for a lot of people, and there is still, as we can tell, a lot of work needs to be done in terms of understanding what the full extent of the problem is, and also how can we begin to approach solutions. So I would like to take a moment as an opportunity to announce our next forum scheduled for July 29th. The topic is Inclusive Prosperity Through Innovation in Entrepreneurship. I posted the registration link to this upcoming event in the chat. I also shared a link to our previous recorded forums in our agenda. And you can find all of that information in the PDF that we shared with you at the top of the hour. And we will also be sharing more information about the upcoming forum and other events in our Insights to Entrepreneurship newsletter. And you can find that same link in the chat as well to register for that newsletter. So we hope you will join us for our future events. And thank you, everybody, again, for sticking it out so long. It's 2 minutes past the time, but we appreciate your time and attention. Have a great day.